Okay, hello, good afternoon. Sorry for the small delay. We're here together with Eva today, Eva Franch. Thank you, Eva, for being here today with us. Eva is the Catalan soul and spirit in the US, representing art and architecture. But she's an architect that she has spent a lot of years lately in the US. She has been studying in several universities there, but mainly she's the chief curator and executive director of the Storefront Gallery, a very interesting and alternative gallery in the New York City, trying to break many of the standards that we have towards architecture, towards art, towards public life and space and socialization. And I think her contribution is very important with this kind of architectural point of view and critical point of view, which is always very powerful. Allow me to maybe read some of her bio for the ones that you don't know. Apart that she's directing the Storefront Gallery, she has taught at several universities, at the State University of New York in Buffalo, at Rice University, where she directed Masters Thesis studio. And she has worked in several projects, important projects at the Storefront Gallery, such as exhibition like No Same, Storefront Storefront for Sale, a kind of radical one, Pop, Protocols, Obsessions, Positions, the launch of the Storefront International Series and projects such as the WorldWide Storefront, and she has been commissioning major design projects such as the Speechbuster and developing projects like the Competition of Competitions. I'm not going to get too much into that detail, you can read that, but just to finish up to say that she will be curating the US Pavilion in the Venice Biennale of Architecture, so good luck with that. And thank you for being here with us, Eva, today.
I'm here today, obviously speaking, as the director of an institution that it can be defined as a gallery, but I like to define it as many other things. It is in certain way an educational institution, yet it is not. It doesn't have a curriculum, it doesn't have students. It is not a museum, mostly because it doesn't have a collection. Yet at the same time it operates sometimes with the same function, cultural exercise that a museum does. It is not a gallery, we don't sell things, yet sometimes we do. And it is not a kitchen, or it is not a place for encounter, yet of course it is those things constantly. Storefront is the figure, is the composite figure of many of those definitions and many of those things. And this is what I will try to explain today about how does one construct a space for alternative action, not necessarily only physical but also mental. Storefront is more than a physical space or a compilation of exercises or actions, space for the understanding and the thinking of what we can do as architects or as artists or as citizens of the world in relationship to the cities and the territories that we inhabit. Before we start though, I want to talk about three crises that I do think that we are inhabiting today and that we are living through. The first one is a crisis of the loss of trust in the structures of governance and the structures of economic and political power. And this loss translates itself with a certain anger. And so, of course, the title of this lecture is called Anger, Impossibilities and Objects, mostly because regardless of what we do, of whatever label society wants to give us, there are certain things that drive us, context and desires. And so in identifying this context, these three elements, these impossibilities, this anger and these objects are the ones that in a certain way will explain you what we do at the Storefront beyond those things that you already know. So if the first drama is this one of inability to understand our relationship to the structures of governance and economical distribution, the second one is the one that as architects or as artists we we occupy. And it's always funny because during this introduction I really have a hard time sitting on a table, because it's very hard to talk about issues that concern visceral understandings of what is that you are doing in the School of Architecture, what is that architects are doing outside of these walls, or what is that artists are doing within museums, has lost over the last few decades the weight and relevance that we acquired over the years within society. If art and architecture was somehow the space for the production and generation of elements that would push the boundaries of society as a space delineated by culture, the real culture was the one that was actually pushing those cultures elsewhere. And I think we have lost that. Architects, we have become too content with our spaces within society, so have artists. The capitalization of culture is perhaps one of the biggest dramas, where in fact we are not looking into a housing bubble or an economic bubble, but we are looking into an art bubble. And the third one, the third crisis, is a crisis mostly of power, and it has to do with how we position ourselves in relationship to the decision makers, and how architects, we are able to not sit outside of the rooms that take the decisions that drive society into its future, but we are and should be sitting into the table that makes those decisions relevant and action. Barcelona has always been a city that perhaps in my imaginary is the most representative about what is the role of an architect in relationship to the political power. We all know how important were the transformations made, obviously with Cerdà, but also in the Olympic Games, but also with many important figures that either as architects or urbanists that in this country is actually sometimes the same and not in the United States, have managed to produce. So within these three dramas, and with this understanding, I always like to think how Sloterdijk, he mentions that anger is what really has always driven all the different conflicts within European society and culture. And yet, what I like more to think, and I don't like to understand our spaces of agitation as spaces of anger, but as spaces of impossibility and our inability to understand how we move forward. I believe that many of you have seen and read the joke of Slavoj Žižek when he talks about the red ink and the blue ink. Does someone not know that joke in the room? You don't know the joke in the room? Great. So we have 300 slides to go through, but I'm going to tell the joke because I think it's important. So this is a guy who's in a small town, and there is war conflict, and he's sent to Moscow, and he's telling his family, you know, I'm going to go away, and my letters are going to be intercepted, and I won't be able to communicate to you and to really tell you what is happening, but I'm going to write you letters. If I write in blue ink, I'm telling you the truth. If I write you in red ink, I'm telling you lies. The guy goes, and like after like 3-4 months, the family waiting, everyone's like, what happened? He's dead. And they receive a letter in blue ink. And they're like, oh, wow. And he's like, Moscow is amazing. The people are fantastic. The films are fabulous. Culture, flourishing. The only thing I cannot find is red ink. So the fact that we don't have the tools in which to express the spaces of revolt is actually a contemporary condition in which we can only express our frustration by an impossibility. And it is in that regard that our production as architects or as writers or as whatever we want to call ourselves are, needs to be framed with very particular spaces of action, and Storefront as such tries to position itself within that space. And the third one, objects, and of course I borrowed these three terms from three philosophers that are still alive, and I think it's important to battle with people who are still constructing their thoughts, comes from Graham Harman, that I'm sure in this school has already found its place, with his object-oriented ontology. And architects, we always have a huge facility to steal thoughts and to banalize them into our own understanding. But what is fascinating about Graham Harman is that he says, there is an object in this room that is not me, nor this table, nor you, but it is that the space that constructs this me, you, this room and this table, this moment in context, there is an object, a relational object for everything that can be understood. And as such, that object can be constructed, represented and modified. And architecture as such, as the discipline that has the privilege and responsibility to articulate all the existing forces and to materialize them, I do believe that in a certain way is very close to what he tries to articulate with his object-oriented ontology, because it is not objects without properties or without organs. They are objects that actually carry the relationships and the effects of the people that are around them. So the kind of historical disassociation that in some spaces of aesthetic discourse has occurred between the subject and the object are totally conflated again into one single space that I think is extremely important. So how do we translate back again really fast into the space of architectural practice or architectural discourse? I always say that there are three types of architects, and I would like you to think as students or already like students of life, how we position ourselves in that space is there are always three types. One is the enabler, one is the iconographer, and one is the agitator. So of course the enabler is the one that wants to facilitate the social, economical, or political forces that are already there. He just or she just tries to translate those forces and be a community organizer, and sometimes a political organizer, or sometimes a mafia organizer. Methodologically, there is no difference between any of those, because if one is not able to question the structures inherited, one just keeps on perpetuating those forces that we have already inherited. I always like to think there is this video that you haven't seen. I always like to look is this like conversation on human nature that Foucault and Chomsky they have about one saying the only task here is to actually unveil and to denounce the structures of power that have constructed the words that we are actually even speaking, and the other one says no, but still there is something good that unites us as a collective or as a society. So the enabler in a certain way tries to play this first role, yet at the same time I don't think it is enough of an architect yet. The second one is the iconographer, is the one who is always interested in constructing forms of signification, and in this quest towards the space of resonance, one ends up doing the easy metaphors and the spaces that try to communicate with a society with a language that we have inherited, and of course in this search of the sublime most of the times ends up being extremely banal and obviously never revolutionary. And with that we encounter a lot of the architectures of form and the exploration of form as a kind of semantic game that is enclosed itself and really unable to construct or generate new terms of engagement. And then we have the third one, that is the agitator, the one that is, I always say, a kind of the son or daughter of this couple, of the enabler and the iconographer, and he's against and he complains and he agitates and he throws stones and denounces, yet at the same time he's unable to produce anything, nor new spaces of collectivity, nor new forms. So I always like to think that there is a fourth type of architect that is at the same time an enabler, an iconographer, and an agitator that denounce existing structures of power, that produces new forms and spaces of signification that are moving us from where we are to where we are going, and at the same time are able to represent and to enable not only existing collective forms, but new collective aspirations. So always moving from this past vector into this inflection of present and time towards the future is where one tries to construct a body of work, either through teaching or building, or in this case being the executive director or chief curator of an institution that is exactly dedicated to be a utopianizer. So this is a book. This is a book that when I was studying in the United States, I asked my family to send me together with a program that was called MRW, M-R-W. Every month they would send you for free 1 kilogram of books, and they would send them express 24 hours, mostly because they are documents and you need them because you're doing a research paper and you need the document for sure. And so I realized that Princeton has a pretty good library, and yet I did miss some books, mostly like the silver editions of where Denise Scott Brown and some of those. What I ask mostly is that I asked my family to empty those books and to put something else inside. I will tell you at the end of the lecture, obviously, what this else is, although I'm sure that you can all start to imagine. What is that that you desire? What would you put in there? Or what would you write in there? Or what would you, as architects, desire to receive or to send to someone? So this, in a certain way, is this idea of anger, impossibility, and at the same time an object. This book comprehends and comprises all of them. And I'm going to explain to you how these three elements, they operate within a storefront. Yes, this looks like a paella, it is a paella. But what we do at the storefront, we operate through 4 different strategies. We work with Trojan horses, we work with MacGuffins, we work with curatorial objects. And this is where one tries to understand the methodologies of action. We produce exhibitions that are impossibilities. We are not interested in the production of architecture as a space of consumption, nor exhibitions as such, but spaces that try to question and rethink that what we do. So if this doesn't look to you as architecture or criticism, I will try to convince you that it is. If this doesn't look to you as an extremely rigorous, serious engagement on architectural discourse, I will convince you that it is. And so this is our lovely MacGuffin effect, and this is, of course, a Trojan horse, if you want. And of course, we can say that this is a curatorial object, a space of impossibility. And definitely we have meta-objects, questions that try to go beyond the questions that we should ask. And so how each one of these elements try to articulate the conversation between these 2 spheres of power. This woman who has never ever heard of an architect sitting next to the dean or the head of the architecture school in the Dominican Republic. How do we bring people together, not to just sit next to each other, but to engage? It's something that I think architecture needs to do in an act of what I call democratizing action. And how do we think about politics? And architecture is not something that only comes through events, comes sometimes through architecture, pure architecture. How many of you have not been into the Mies Pavilion? Probably would not have any of the hands up. But how do we think about that building? We can think about the detail, about the cross, if those crosses do actually are not the structural elements, if the smell, if the cleaning. So many different structures, and artists have been working from Montadas to Andres Hake recently, to Kate Glass, trying to understand and to give us how do we think about this building. And I like to think about this building in a very particular way. This is the picture of the encounter of the monarch that was going to open and inaugurate this pavilion, and Mies van der Rohe. And what is fascinating about this building is that for me it represents probably one of the most politically visceral exercises in an architecture of the 20th century. When Alphonse XIII, he arrived to inaugurate the pavilion, he searched obviously for his central space as the king. That's what architecture had been providing for years, a space of centrality, a space of symmetry in which the king was at the center and everyone else was at the edge. Yet when he arrived there, and you all have arrived there, what you find is a stair position in a tangential space in relationship to that base, into that atrium, into that plinth. And when you go up, what you encounter yourself is with a surface of water in which the reflection of the walls and almost the reflection of yourself and of other people start appearing. You move to the right, and as if you were going to enter elsewhere, yet you find yourself in this threshold between the inside and the outside, yet there is a center there, but that's not the center of any king, not that king. So the king, of course, turns right again, and then he enters, and he tries to find that central space that maybe is in the center of symmetry of those marvels on the wall, yet that's also not his center. And he continues, of course, because there are 2 chairs, but that's not a throne, and he continues and he arrives until the end and to a pool in which again there is a symmetry of a woman that is really covering herself from the sun that belonged to him, that is not anymore his. And yet he starts moving around that space centripetally to find himself in a surface in which everyone is actually the king of their own ground. Because in that space of fluidity, symmetry, is on the ground, not anymore vertical. So if the French, they cut heads and kings with a guillotine, I believe that Mies did it with a building. And of course, that's my reading of how I think architecture can be political. So, of course, we do storefronts through 5 different spaces of actions. We do exhibitions, we do publications, we do competitions, we do events, and we do projects. And I'm going to trailblaze through some of those. So of course, Storefront has been the place, it was founded 30 years ago by a guy, Kyung Park, who believed very much in the need to produce an alternative space of action. This was a storefront. It didn't start in the space that we all know. It started in this space, in a kind of residual corner, in actually just Prince Street. If we actually like to think of a storefront as this space that we constantly refer as an incredible facade that we can recognize almost as a kind of canonical figure, what I like to think of a storefront is not anymore as this, but as this. We're interested in what happens there, in the activities, and this is why it's the image of this lecture, because we are interested in how we live, how we inhabit storefront through that. So from 1982, when in fact the Institute for Urban Studies and many of the institutions of architecture were trying to articulate a critical discourse of architecture, Kyung Park founded a storefront in which people would really come into the streets. And this is the triangular space that we know today. People were really addressing some of the issues that were very pressing. In that case was public toilets and public space. Some of the other issues that were really trying to be addressed were really not that peaceful. They were not this aesthetic that we are used to see. This facade design in 1994 by Stephen Hall and Vito Conchi as a collaborative project has made the storefront survive over the years. Yet what is the essence of it is this. It is thinking and talking about homelessness and how architecture and how art and how people can think about issues that no one else is dealing and willing to actually address. Queer Space was a show in 1994. When in like 2 years ago, marriage became legalized, a small fragment of that space went away, but still there is a lot to be discussed. Or when some exhibition from Yves Klein, or even when Dan Graham, he had some of the first shows about his suburban projects. Storefront has been the place where the careers of people like Liz Diller and Ricardo Scofidio started. When they were practicing and no one was really taking seriously what they were doing, Storefront was the place that would allow them to do what they wanted. Storefront has try to be committed to the spaces of social action and try to understand what happens when the only thing that we have to say when we protest in Occupy Wall Street in that sign is that to say that this is a sign. How do we transform that? How do we try to produce a space of exhibition that even if in its aesthetic nature tries to at the same time produce a political effect? Exhibitions, of course, try to deal with architecture, but mostly with the experimentation of a space and how that is in and of itself an act of rethinking architecture. This is Daniel Arsham digging a space. This is an installation by Hands on Hand, where in fact we took their works that they did in the favelas in Rio de Janeiro and tried to understand how we could create a new discipline. If we cannot be Hausmann or Cerda anymore, can we produce a new painting urbanism? And of course we have seen a very great deal of examples in the last 2 years of that. We have transformed the space into a temple in which all the different religions of New York were presented with a project by Matilde Casani with an archive and archaeology of all the religious spaces throughout parking lots, garages, rooftops, in New York. This is a project that is fascinating, how we are not bringing into the spaces of visibility. Before I was in the studio of Pablo and we were saying how do we bring into the world of the visible those things that are invisible that are still really driving in fact the lives of citizens, the societies and the collectives that inhabit that are not necessarily there for us to see. Yet at the same time we also experiment through other disciplines that do just simply try to touch the visceral gut, and this is people from the Mies dance company before they actually dismantled, taking the space and actually transforming the gallery into a stage, but not only for them to perform, but in fact for the audience that was inside to become the performers. And that flipping out in which now I could say I'm not lecturing, you are lecturing, is the importance of the space and the powerfulness of this building. This building was designed again in 1994 and it was supposed to last for 6 months. We built it without a building permit. We always say we ask for mercy, not for permission. And the person that had to go and do the next facade was Neil Denari. He still reminds me every time I see him that, Eva, by the way, I'm the next to come. And what happens is that even 20-something years after, the facade still is as radical and provocative as it was in that moment of inception. And this is the nature of the space, where temporality is not that we don't do exhibitions every 2 months or every 6 months. Sometimes we do exhibitions that last an hour. Or there are exhibitions that maybe you're not conscious, but they are lasting already for like 3 years, or 10 years, or 30 years. Or as this one that has been lasting for 20 years. So, trying to understand sometimes the spaces that an institution like the Storefront can contribute into the understanding and the conversation that as architects we carry. Sometimes we like to think that we are figures, independent elements that have to contribute with one voice, but we are interested in bringing people together. So this is an exhibition that is an annual tradition that we started 2 years ago, or 2 years ago, and this year we are going to break it because there is nothing better than a tradition than to break it. And it's a drawing show. And it's a drawing show that I started out of the frustration of realizing how students and architects and colleagues and really successful architects were starting to use representation as if there was no power in there, as if we only had to make pictures for the clients to buy something. And so this, the first year we started with aesthetics and aesthetics, and the second year we did pop. And pop doesn't stand for pop, but for protocols, obsessions, and positions. As architects we inherit, we have to learn the protocols. We need to have an obsession as individual beings. All of you carry something inside that obviously differentiates us from everyone else, and that's how that obsession is extremely important to flesh out. But what is extremely important is how that obsession is a position. Dealing constantly with artists who sometimes find themselves too happy in their obsession, I constantly say, sure, I love your obsession, but tell me what is that position. The figure of the curator that has emerged over the last few years actually is just simply someone who is able to articulate the obsession that someone has into a position. So if you don't have a position, don't worry. Find a friend, find a so-called curator, or ask your mother. Right? How do we actually make some of those things matter? We try to do it through drawings. So the first year when we did aesthetics and aesthetics, we looked actually into green, children, clouds and birds, axonometries and comics. When we try to make our drawings speak, when they want to be green, we paint them green. When we want them to be lively and hopeful, we put balloons, a lot of balloons and children. I'm sure that some of you have put some children and balloons in your drawings. And we really care about those clouds and those birds. I mean, there are some magnificent birds on those renderings. And the question is why? Why do we need to put that makeup into the architecture? And it's not that I don't need lipstick. I love my lipstick. I have lipstick. But what is the essence of that act of drawing into those architectures? And why are comics in there? Obviously, because sometimes we don't know how to make a drawing speak. But someone would ask, and why are axonometries there? And the problem is that axonometries, they have also become aesthetic devices. When one wants to be rigorous and intellectual, one uses axonometries. Yet still, we are devoiding the tools of representation. And so the question here is, how do we go? How do we break beyond those green, those axonometries? So we asked 30 architects, please, can you draw us Storefront? Just a Storefront. We gave them the same size. We gave them the same space. And people started drawing Storefront over and over. And what was fascinating is that by drawing the same space, what we started to realize were the ideological and the methodological differences embedded in that act of drawing. And I remember the first year, Bernard Tschumi, he came while we were still installing, and we were looking into the drawings, and we started to discuss the exercise of really drawing that space. And there was something fascinating. He said, I don't think I've ever managed to see a space represented in so many different ways while I was inhabiting it. And that space in which multiplicities start to occur. So of course the second year we invited him, and this was his transcript, or Jimenez Lay in his understanding of the space, or Vision Arc, or this is June 14th, in which saying storefront is just a mirror, in fact that it reflects that what is happening outside within the field. Or when we had like a Kulper drawing this map of Manhattan that is a dragon that is being eaten by this other dragon that is a zoom in from the place in which a storefront is, in which this zoom in there is a vector of different elements and people from cultural agency and so. And one would go and look through each one of these drawings and discover a total space of criticality. This was a drawing that actually just shows that the storefront is this sliver, is probably one of the thinnest. This is the corner, the real corner of a storefront, in which that's exactly what the storefront occupies within the architectural imaginary, or how that could become a new model, or how this is for Kirsten Gears and David Van Severen. Again, a storefront is just this like space that tries to make an act while the curtains of the architectural spectacle or the clouds are closing. Did they tell me about this? No. I'm reading into them. And this is the pleasure of actually every year receiving 30 drawings that you have no idea what they are going to do. And like this one, you find this drawing that is by Andrew Zago, in which you say, yes, the storefront looks like a triangle, it's almost like a boat. Yet in fact the facade is this element, the institution is floating above this space that is moving, that is architecture and the discipline above. We are hovering above, but the legacy and the weight that we carry is above us, yet a bit behind us. We are moving, we are in the edge of this boat, yet it seems that sometimes we are going to lose that we are carrying. Because it is true, we are always about to fail. And we failed through many exhibitions, in which this was a great installation in which the panels were attached to strings and microphones and the entire space could be played by the visitors. Yet, did it work? Just halfway. Yet it was great. Yes, it was a great experiment. And you know that better than anyone. How to allow, I just saw it today in the Fundació Joan Miró, how to allow spaces, how to allow artists to fail. Well, we allow architects to fail, and artists too, but in a way that matters for, let's say, the city and the territories abroad. This was an exhibition that was called Past Futures, Present Futures. We selected 101 projects around New York and around its history that were never built, visionary projects. And we asked 101 architects around the world to remake them. And to remake them for today or to remake them for the future. So of course, imagine you are told there is an exhibition of 101 visionary projects. And you're like, wow, I'm going to see extreme renderings, and we all have an idea of what this exhibition looks like. What happens then is that you encounter and you enter into an exhibition where in fact the first thing you encounter is almost just a mirror, a reflection of yourself looking and searching for this vision of this future. And of course people would come into the exhibition trying to find these features, and they would find nothing except that between these curtains of reflection they would start finding contextual forms. Places in which you would find the year. New York, it would tell you the inhabitants, who was the mayor, what was the relevant fact. The world, the population, a relevant fact, Western culture, literature, art, film, and it was giving you an entire list of elements that happened in 1967. And in the bottom was telling you, if you cannot imagine what visionary project was produced within this context, we invite you to scan this QR code, and that would bring, of course we didn't care that you would get the project, we wanted the exercise, the delay of the pleasure, of the gratification of actually seeing that project. Does that frustrate people? Yes. But that's part of actually taking the braveness of having people being extremely frustrated and giving them that space of desire and training that kind of slowness. We had a room where the images could be consumed, yet those images were broken apart again, and you were at the same time looking those projects and at the same time look at yourself, looking at them by this mirror. And of course then there was this forest of images and projects of these remakes in which people were able to really bring. But the idea of hiding an exhibition that has a highly visual nature was the commission that we gave to Leon Leon, like, we need to produce a heterochronic space. How do we produce a space in which you lose the notion of time, right? Not that heterotopia, it's not an other space, it's another time in which these 100 years dissolve, in which architecture takes command. And so of course now we are in the time of publishing the book and taking the projects and remaking that space of desire into a space of temporality that allows for those projects and the consequences to be understood and to be projected into another dimension. We are a storefront for art and architecture. And I always say it's not art nor architecture either, it's about the end. And it is about the end mostly because society likes to give us label of expertise to actually fit within a system of behaving, right, mostly. But we are very much more interested in the misbehave. This was a show that we just closed last week by Sebastian Errázuriz, who is a, you could call it an artist, you could call it a designer, you could call it a problematizer. We opened it in February 14th, that was called Tough Love. Because what we had done is to spend a few months looking into the work that media is doing with us, and with society, and with culture, and these real issues that we confront ourselves daily. We look into homelessness, we looked into missing children, we looked into racism, we look into rapes, we look into the gun problem, and how do we actually start thinking about the question of undocumented and visa, and how do we produce works that are able to persist a bit longer than that cover of the newspaper or that fifth article in the newspaper that we used to watch. So this jacket that we actually were selling for $100,000, it was a jacket that could be worn by a football player or a rapist, or a football player that happens to be a rapist that is being defended by the football team of his college because he's able to win or earn millions of dollars for their college. Therefore, when the girl is actually accusing them of rape, they're going to say, no, it didn't really happen. So there are a lot of really crude things happening out there, and it is very hard to see how we can empower through our own actions the idea and the reflection behind what is actually happening. How do we look into the idea of labor and the idea of undocumented people, but also the idea of the conditions of labor of that? Now there is an entire awareness group also within the US about undocumented people in the US, but also in Qatar, and the working conditions and how slavery actually finds a new form within the buildings that sometimes as architects we build. And it's not that we are not responsible of them, we should. So if we were able to deal with that, we were also able to deal with economical constructions and structures of running an institution. We were just talking, how are we doing here? And said, it's great, but you know, there is no money. There is no money anywhere. Culture doesn't know still how to insert itself within the spaces of capitalism. And so I'm really trying. So we said, let's sell the place, yeah? Let's sell. You could buy me. You could buy me for a month. Of course, you would retire me for a month. You could buy the space, you could buy the chair, you could buy the... We were buying even the ghosts of a storefront. We were selling them. And the idea here is that how do we really try to think about that? So we invited like 7 different artists and architects to make us proposals about how do we sell storefront. And within that, from this small insertion into the wall of all the spaces in New York that carry the names of their donors, to this like monopoly game of all the corporate sponsorships, to the shut up storefront that fake industries proposed, we really try to understand what is the relationship between culture and money, and the spaces of prostitution, if you want, of ideas versus capital. So how do we keep on doing that, and how do we try to engage not only with the structures of power and capital, but at the same time with the structures of power? We are opening an exhibition next Tuesday that is called Letters to the Mayor. We actually have some people here in the room that are writing letters to the mayor of Barcelona, and so we have letters to the mayor of Madrid, we have letters to the mayor of Mexico, we have letters to the mayor obviously of New York. And the idea here is that if you were to write a letter to the mayor, what would you write? And the problem here is that we have not been sitting close enough to that chair. So of course this pattern that is a beautiful wall pattern, that is what we have become as architects, is actually a wall pattern that is made of all these things that mayors like to do when they go and open our buildings, that is to give a speech, to break ground, to actually give a very, like, cut a ribbon. And so this wallpaper that is the wallpaper of the collective imaginary that sometimes mayors they have is what we really try to take out through the words of all these more than 50 people that are going to be speaking into the world. One very anecdotal fact about this exhibition is that we only asked, I don't know if you look into the names, but we only asked women, actually 2 men. But just because, again, the rule confirms the exception, right? And mostly we actually asked women by the fact that there is another issue that has to do a lot with gender and it has to do with like equality on salary and how do we do that? And so of course we can say, oh, this is an exhibition about women. No, it's not. It's about the mayor, it's about politics, and it's about architecture. It just happened to be that it's just women. And so the whole thing is that there are different ways of denouncing, and of course now I'm delivering it to you. Yet the question here is how do we really try to continue the conversation without alienating others? So how does a normal event at the storefront look? Well, like this. More people outside than inside, usually. More people drunk and talking about what they are doing and their frustrations than listening to what is actually happening. And that is exactly it. Because what is very important today is how do you bring people together? I have no idea how many partnerships, emotional for sure as well, but professional and ideological have started at the storefront in that space. And this is exactly the power of the events. How do we break the conventions to try to engage with ourselves but also with our conventions differently? This was a instant drawing project that we tried to project into the skin of New York with AutoCAD. We asked people to draw with AutoCAD for 3 minutes and project directly into the facades of New York to actually understand how when we draw in that element, the creativity obviously is always there. The storefront we have, and I'm a fan of taxonomies, and probably because chaos is the only way to be organized by having the illusion of order, we have produced a series of events. The manifesto series, obviously, is one of them, and one would say, why a manifesto today? And I will talk about this a bit later. But one of the interesting events that I realized was important to do in New York was the productive disagreements. When I was in Princeton, I had a very hard time finding people to disagree. I would present a project, and people would say, interesting, right. Sure. And they would start their discourse and everything was fantastic. And I came from Barcelona in which criticism was visceral, not always right. But I enjoyed that space because it was able to push your ideas further. I have very good friends in which we just simply enjoy the space of dialogical violence just for the sake of argumentation. And that pleasure that is very, in a certain way, maybe Mediterranean, it's not very present in there. So we produced these productive disagreements, and in the first event, it was an event with a book by Malki Soshan, that is the Atlas of the Conflict. We brought people from the Palestinian lobby and the Israeli lobby. We know they disagree, right? They didn't. An hour of conversation without one disagreement. So I realized that my curatorial strategies didn't work, right? Because I told them that they had to disagree. We knew they disagreed. They just had to explain how they disagree and know how we can get closer to that agreement of the disagreement. No. So I said, okay, let's do it differently. Let's make a total enthusiasm. And people were like, what is that? I'm like, we get people a glass of wine and we ask everyone to make a toast. And they were like, okay. And of course, one needs to understand different cultures. Like when you're in the wedding and you have your cousin making a toast and just start saying things that he shouldn't. That happens the same. When you ask people to say nice things about someone else, they always insert a space of criticism. And so we happen to find the total enthusiasm more critical than the productive disagreement. So this is Cynthia Davison talking about the Clip Stanfold book, opening at the storefront. And then we started, of course, the interrogation series. When you produce a book, what is that book about? Is it an act of narcissism? You just want to have your book because it's your work, because you love it, because you have spent so many hours, or because you have a position, because people should read it. And so the idea of the interrogation series is extremely important, or the cabaret series. I mean, this is Craig Buckley, a PhD from Princeton University, now already graduated, but at that time he was still writing his dissertation. I don't think his dissertation made more sense to me ever than when it was coming out of that cloud. And so the idea is that how do we produce spaces, sometimes of course there are formal roundtables, to have those thoughts come across. Sometimes we take a stool, it's snowing outside, and we just are between shows and we have the wall in the paint on the walls and we just make it happen. Or sometimes someone who is still just graduating says, Eva, I want to have a conversation about formlessness with the people who have held that discourse. So this was an event that happened in September, I think 2011 or so. And so these two guys, Garrett and Julian, they said, Eva, we want to do an event about formlessness. And I said, again, they're like, yes, yes. I'm like, okay, fine. And so they said, we'd like to bring Hal Foster and Eva Lambois, and we brought like Vito Conchi and Michael Meredith and so on, and we did that event, and everyone discussed and so on. And what happened after a year of editing text and banging everyone, we got a publication series started. So that event that just happened in an hour and a half at the storefront, that sometimes they are totally useless and sometimes they come really as a disaster, sometimes they don't. And when they don't, then that's what we do with them, right? We make a book and we design it with Natasha Jen from Pentagram, and Lars Müller helps us put it outside into the world. So, of course, we talk about the paellas, and I'm not going to explain that because I already explained one joke, but the ones that do not know about McGuffin effects should look into that. And so the idea is that if I'm cooking a paella for you and I'm going to be very visceral with you and I'm going to ask you very difficult questions, I'd rather do it behind a paella pan. Because if I'm in a table with a microphone, I might come a bit as aggressive. Yet if I'm cooking for you and you're hungry and you're waiting for it, you might take that question and you might answer it. And that is where, in fact, the performance, if you want, and the act of being a curator and the act of really trying to ask the right questions make that paella not just a dish, but also a space in which ideas can emerge. And it positions closer the thoughts not in our rational being, but to this space of the, what I call the critical gut. So, of course, the events, they really try to sometimes make it into the publications, but one of the essential publications that we have done over the last 30 years is the Storefront newsprint. It's the only thing that we have done constantly over 30 years, and it's something that every time that we talk about the digital medium has entered into crisis, yet we keep on doing it, and it is also space for the experimentation of designers to really try to think what it goes into that space. We do books, and we have published different books for different reasons, and this is the one that is on the works, and of course this is the one I just mentioned you. And the idea is how this book is impossible to read, but this is how I read probably. I read like 5 pages and then I fall asleep, and then someone calls and then I check and this book is that example, or this other book that actually has to do with double copies and fakes, that is a manifesto that is not a manifesto, it's also one of the manifesto series. It really tries to look into different ways in the ways we produce books. So of course, when I was talking about the manifestos, why am I interested in manifestos, and why it is important to understand the formats in which obsessions can become positions. A manifesto does 3 things. First, it articulates a position, but it does it by doing one thing, that is to denounce a past or a present condition. And the act of denouncing is extremely important. The second thing that the manifesto does, it establishes a space of desirable action. And that space of desire is that the content of that book that we just mentioned. And the third thing, it shows a methodology of action. And that's always the hardest to do, because you can denounce and sometimes you can desire. But how do you get there? That methodology is what sometimes becomes a drawing or a typological or a space of research. So these books, they really try to bring some of these questions further, as some of the questions that we have been asking historically have just taken other formats, not the one of books, but the one of, this case, competitions. If we were to reimagine what are the symbols of freedom, or the Statue of Liberty. This was a competition that was held way back when it was like the 75th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty. If we were to, of course, imagine on money, and this is fascinating because we now in Zagreb, with the Think Space, we have been also looking into what is money and what are the spaces of capital and what is the relationship of architecture to it. And so these are competitions, this happened in 1984. So what is interesting is that within the archive of a storefront, one can find hints, small questions of things that we already asked. This was a competition that was run by the previous directors, so Storefront has had many different ghosts. I always say I'm the current ghost, but we had Joseph Grima before, and Sarah Herda before, and Kyung Park, and Shirin Neshat. And the idea is that how these questions try to touch different people around the world, but sometimes also how they touch the immediacy of New York. Some of the competitions get built, and with this Street Fest competition that we started together with the new museum for the Idea City Festival, we realized that I was part of this committee and organizing the festival, and we realized that we're going to spend a huge amount of money. The new museum was going to spend a huge amount of money renting those tents for this Street Fest to happen, and I said, no, we should definitely try to make something with that. There are a lot of architects that could make with that money something that is able to push the ideas of those white, horrible tents. So that's what we did. We made a competition and said, please, show us that with this money and some ideas, something can happen. And I wanted to show some of the ideas that were submitted to the competition that probably were the most radical ones, and we could not make them happen for other reasons. But this is the one that actually won this last year, and of course it is being built. And there is some kind of like instant gratification on that, in going from a question like this one, like this is from Occupy Wall Street, to something that is actually built and is able to bring the gazes and to transform the spaces of encounter. How much more time do I have? Because I have no idea. I didn't ask how long should I go, but because we are just halfway. No, we are almost done. No, I don't know. So, for the competitions of competitions, I want to actually invite you to look into this brief online. How many competitions are you looking at probably every week or month? It's like, I really want to do this competition, but I don't want to pay the fee. But I really want to, and I want to do a museum, but is this one going to be built? And this was a competition that was asking you what competition you think the mayor of your town or your city or the developer or a certain agency should run. And the question here has to do with the fact that we have not been asking the questions enough. As architects, we should be able to say, we don't need more museums, or we don't need more like civic centers, or we don't need more X, Y, and Z. Instead, what we do is like, oh, I'm going to design it. Maybe we don't have money, nor need, nor curators, nor content for it, but don't worry, I'm going to design it. We have the responsibility and the duty to say there are new needs, there are new forms, there are new spaces. And that is what we should send as proposals to the mayors of our cities. So this competition asked that. Write a brief, and we are going to send it. So the winners of this competition are going to be presented in this exhibition that we are opening next week. But sometimes the projects, they take a smaller scale, less of a political ambition and more of a just urban ambition. We don't do architecture for humanity, but this project was what we call Chairs for Urbanity. Together with Ramlabor, a collective in Berlin, we produced this fabricator in which people could bring chairs in New York. There was one thing I missed terribly, is this urban space of the city of Barcelona, where you find a bench in every second corner. New York doesn't. So we produced chairs, and people, you could find them walking with the chairs to try to put them in their neighborhoods. So small interventions like this, or a bit bigger, just like framing and inhabiting a space like a park in order to make events happen, or in this case creating a table that is the same size as the gallery, that we commissioned to Jimenez Ley and Grayson Cox as a way to understand how can we go and move into other spaces to have the same type of conversations, and with this try to construct new spaces of engagement. The idea of a Speechbuster or a Spacebuster, as this track from Ramlabor that we commissioned already like 5 years ago. The Speechbuster right now is in a journey through different spaces in New York, right now inside Rafael Viñoly's architectural office, in which this table will try to explode some of the conversations. Some of the projects, they don't take the form that we would have imagined architecture to take. They take the form of disguises or costumes, a bit closer to these images that we carry, and to try to ask the question of how a party or how a Halloween, that for me as a professor, seeing my students spending time preparing their costumes as zombies or sexy nurses frustrated the hell out of me. I decided to create a new party, a Halloween, but a critical Halloween. So the first year we said, what is the most feared ghost of art or architecture production? And probably why oblivion is the thing that you and I, we fear the most. We don't want to be forgotten. We want to be remembered forever because we were so great. But let's leave that one apart. The other really serious ghost is, and a scary one, is banality. So with the ghost of banality, we ask architects to come and party with us and to come with ideas about what banality was. So of course we got some costumes of all kinds. Some of them got it, some of them didn't. But some of them were very fascinating, like the lasso tool of Photoshop. I mean, it's really banal. I mean, it really never really truly works, right? I mean, it's terrible. And the second year, when we asked the same question, we ask it like differently. We said that one of the most really banal things as well is a metaphor, but a bad metaphor, because there are really good metaphors. And so we made, I think, the first bibliography for a party, for a Halloween party. So we had in our website an entire bibliography in which you could actually go and look and read. And so the readings go all the way down to, like, from white mythology, starting by an article in Quaderns, and I just heard that yesterday you got the new Quaderns out, so congratulations on that. And to really try to bring the space of fun and debauchery closer to the space of critical thinking. Why you cannot read a book? Why do you have to read a book for a paper or an exam or for pure pleasure? Like, let's try to embody those things into our every single days and acts. So this bibliography really managed to produce incredible costumes. Of course, the Bilbao effect, and of course the open hand from Le Corbusier, and of course the housing bubble, right? And of course, how does one take metaphors differently is important. But this is a costume from the first year that when we were addressing the concept of banality. And so, by the way, this is our associate curator at the Storefront, Carlos Mínguez, who is one of the 5 people who ran that place together with me. So while the Storefront looks like this huge big place sometimes, we have been in the basement for 28 years, 9 years. We have been for a year out of the basement, and it's 5 people and a huge amount of interns and volunteers that make this happen. But going back into this, this was a scary costume to me. When I saw these guys, I was like, who are they? I mean, they look like Hillary Clinton, and I don't know. I mean, and they were quiet and they would not move. And it was a party. I mean, it was trying to be fun. And when people were entering, they were leaving the name of their costumes at the entrance. And so when we were in the jury, that was like Liz Diller and Wangechi Mutu and the critic of the New York magazine, Justin Davidson, their title was Skellies. They're the little figures that we put in our models, right, to represent the scale of people, of humans, the ones who live in our buildings. And they are still those fucking archaic little white lady with a bag, the guy, and so we cannot think of the contemporary subject, can we? So the representation of these people in our drawings, in our models, they are so banal. So I do hope that none of you ever will put those little white figures unless you really want to engage with the banality of that evil. So, and of course we can go from Halloween to try to really, this was 4 years ago when we were really trying to understand what are the spaces for the production of ideas. And now this is very easy with all these collaborative tools, but 4 years ago to have a place in which you could all draw simultaneously was not that common. So together with Joshua, we created this Draw Think Tank that was an application where 10 people could draw simultaneously at the same time. And we were just really trying to test at the time the lines and the possibilities. But the idea here is that I get very nervous when I'm in my drawing and someone comes and draws in top of my drawing, like, don't touch my drawing. And like, here you have your onion paper, right? But the idea is that if we were to do that digitally, right? If we were, sometimes there's people who can have a think tank because they like to use the speech and the word, but there are people who are not that good in words, they're really good with drawings. So almost like this kind of kid childish game. We need to produce spaces for us, innovate as well through tools, through the production of softwares. So, of course, I just mentioned before that we left the basement and we now have offices with windows, like if we would be in the 20th century. And yet what do we do with the basement? We said, well, let's do something with it. So we did TV studio. We created a TV studio in which we didn't know exactly what to do, so we asked some very good friends to tell us what they wanted to do. So we had 3 guests, and so things like this happen, in which one night just simply like 10 musicians would come and show up and produce. This was together with ESP TV, who are almost kind of professionals of the impromptu TV station and produce spaces of total debauchery. We asked Prem Krishnamurti, who is a good friend, and so it was over a dinner, said, Prem, have you ever really thought about doing a TV show? And he said, yeah. And I said, okay, let's do one. So we did one. And so this is the basement of a storefront in which we painted it with this obviously green chroma element. And he made a TV program that is called P, Perchance. And everyone that is invited to the program, their name starts by P, or they have to wear a hat, or a pizza. And so, of course, we had Parker Posey, who is an actress, and so he managed to really bring the most surreal characters into the place. And of course, some people like wore hats because their name was not starting by P, but they really wanted to participate in this night talk conversation. And of course, within that, we also had pizzas. I mean, we had people coming with pizzas. And so, if you want to see any of that, I encourage you to watch online. I don't expect anything, but strange awe. But what is fascinating is that we asked a third person, that is Michael Young, who is the person that I know on this earth that knows more about drawing, representation, and technology. And so he made 4 different programs about drawing. And of course, who is afraid of the big bad box? But the idea is that he would talk about what is the difference between an analogic line, or an ink line, or a pen line, or a magnetic line, or a line, and so on and so on and so on. So these TV programs that try to talk about some of the things that we do is something that we are now going to send an open call for pilot programs. So if you ever fantasized of getting in front of the TV screen and broadcasting into the world, this is what we are doing. Of course, we had game shows and all kind of different elements, but to say that we are not afraid to fail into the space of sometimes uncritical debauchery, but sometimes we really try to understand what it means to produce projects around the world. And so for many years, a lot of people keep on asking, could you please, Eva, come to our city? We would like to do something with you. And I always say, well, we are not necessarily a franchise, and we are not necessarily, we don't know what is happening in your place. Why don't you tell us? So with Sashi Hoshikawa and the people from the Laboratorio de Arquitectura Dominicano, we had this conversation for quite a while, and after a year of me trying to figure out how do we do something, yes or not, suddenly I realized that there was a way we could go to the Dominican Republic. And it was to do this Storefront International Series, and what I asked them, I said, let's start the conversation by having 3 things. Tell me contested sites in your city that are unresolved. Tell me issues that concern society at large. And the third, tell me the people within your context you think can contribute within the local knowledge, resolve or start a conversation with the knowledge of cause. So we started this international series by identifying serious concerns, sites, and problematics. So we went to the Dominican Republic over 6 days. We went into like 9 different sites, addressing questions of progress, questions of tourism, in places that were not necessarily the most canonical ones. This is a car wash. The first conversation we had it in Punta Cana. And if one thinks Punta Cana, one thinks of the high-end resort places, yet you need to know that there is an entire hinge space in which all the service people that are either going to like clean your room or go and work into the sugar plantations are going to go there and wait for a bus to take them, either to release their passport into these pseudo-slavery camps or into these spaces of service. So this place is called Cruce de Verón. Cruce de Verón is dangerous, as 500 times the locals told me, Eva, we cannot go there, Eva, we cannot go there, Eva, it's dangerous. We said, no, we are going to go there. So we went there, and this was a car wash in which the night before I had to dance, obviously, with the owner, and we were all there to convince him that we had to take this place. But this place is a car wash, a nightclub, a whorehouse, a hairdresser, it's everything you can imagine. And that kind of, when we talk about condensers or social condensers, or when we talk about programmatic uses, if we stay inside our auditoriums trying to talk about progress in the Dominican Republic, we are never going to figure it out. So the entire project consists, and the international series consists, in going out, in finding spaces. This is in Domina Film Studios. It's a place that understood the horizon and the coloration of the scene, a particular site, to figure out that this was the place where they could film all the pirates of the Caribbean. So an individual who had that vision realized a business model with particular reading of a site and so on. So the idea is sometimes was again to just cook a paella or to go into one of the really dangerous favelas with one of the projects that were already part of there, to try to bring this guy who actually constantly hated, if it's too dangerous, I'm not going there, and said, don't come. Or to go into the border between Dajabon and Haiti, in which there is this binational market every week where people from Haiti come to exchange goods from people from the Dominican Republic, and what you encounter is this. Landscapes of clothing, bunches of bags of textile with women on top of it, mostly women with their eyes lost into the horizon. And then you're like, okay, there are 50 non-for-profits in here. And you cannot see a book nor a space, nothing in that market that was built 2 years ago. And this is what you encounter. In fact, disclose all the humanitarian help that is being sent and is being intercepted, and then it is being sold because it's the only real space for redistribution. So, of course, we had to drive 10 hours in a van, and we went there with Andres Jaque and like several people that we invited from international voices to come with the local voices to discuss local issues, and we really didn't find answers, but we become suddenly in a certain way advocates and eyes for something that we would have to address. And the same when in the Lisbon Triennale they invited us to be part of this Lisbon Triennale. I said, Beatriz is like, I don't like to be part of those things unless I have a very good strategy of subversion like the US Pavilion, but we are going to come, yet at the same time we are going to get out. So we were given a space, and the only thing we did was to simply put a graffiti to say get out, and get out into the city. Let's take the city as the space for action. And we started talking about things that actually resonate very much with things in Barcelona, about the question of the old and the elderly. And we went into a park, and of course we talked with local people, but also with people who were visiting the Triennale. We always like to bring foreign voices with local voices. So here we had Andrés Jaque and Jiménez Ley and some of the people who are really working in the site, together with the guys playing chess next to us. And so over the course of the conversation, what you could see is that while the guys were there, they would pass by, and suddenly the kids were playing, and those are things that sometimes they inform, sometimes they don't. And the same with political domesticities, just taking the stairs in front of a project that was looking into the interiors, or taking this new form of what you could call is a derive. And sometimes they bring you into incredible architectural spaces. Who wouldn't want to have this as their stage? This is obviously Caesar's building that is abandoned. There is nothing inside. It was produced for a firework of a moment that was trying to follow, obviously, the success of Barcelona and its understanding of revitalizing and becoming a global capital. So the idea of branding and marketing, that was the issue that we were addressing here, was never better illustrated than by sitting there and seeing every 10 minutes this little bus, this city bus of Portugal and tourists coming and taking a picture of it. So the fact that, like, from this to this, right, there are very different contexts, yet they are extremely important. And so this is where, in fact, we are really trying to take the space of the gallery that has already always been very much on the street, really outside of it. So of course, that also includes cooking a paella outside in a space in which the curators of the Triennale were sitting across, and then you could say, what is the void that we are feeding here in producing culture by the clock? And it was very nice, mostly because that day I didn't feel like cooking a paella, I didn't want to cook a paella, I was tired, and at the same time I knew I wanted to have that conversation. And I knew that the only way I could have that conversation openly with my friends, who are all these people, and many of you were there, was to really doing through that. One would have never endured 2 hours that we were there talking about what it means. We got bored, we got silences. How many times do we get silences today? How many times do you get a silence and you're like, wow, I really don't know what to say right now. And you're still waiting because you're waiting for food. And that is fascinating, the idea of the silence, and I'm not going to hold on that because I keep on talking mostly. But What is going to happen with all these projects that we are doing? Before, and I'm going to finish with the project that we are presenting at the Biennale, you need to know that at the same time, I like to do several things, obviously, but I like to exercise the spaces of criticism to the spaces that are supposed to be the spaces of criticism, and so on and so on. So it's this kind of babushka project. So I said, there is no sense in making biennales. What is a biennale if not space in which either politicians, they want to put themselves into the center of cultural capital? What is a biennale if not people trying to self-empower themselves by bringing all the other friends into their network? What is a biennale when you have to spend $500,000 by going elsewhere to represent something that maybe you're not even not, and something that is not going to change even what you really are? So what is the function and what is the sense of really going to the Venice Biennale or going to the Guangzhou Biennale or going to any of those things? And I was really, I went to enough of them to realize that I didn't want to go to any more of them. And I said, okay, we are going to do a worldwide Biennale, meaning we're going to do a Biennale in which you're going to do your project in Barcelona, I'm going to do one in New York or in El Delta del Ebre, or someone's going to do it in Caracas, the other one is going to do it in Johannesburg, and we're going to do a Biennale. We have enough means of communication today to be able to bring us together in some form, that we could actually invest that $500,000 in making something that actually contributes radically to our context. So at the same time, of course, I came across with an idea that I really wanted to put out into the Venice Biennale, and then of course we started running both of them, and while this one was being designed by Natasha Jen and Pentagram and so on, we got the notice from the State Department that we got the Venice Biennale, therefore we could not call this the WorldWide Biennale, we had to call it something else. So we call it WorldWide Storefront. Well, I'm just giving you a lot of back information to understand how this thing positions itself into something that I'm actually also doing. At the same time, what is this? So we made a call for applications. We are actually going to have the jury in a week and a half, and we are going to open this fall, hopefully 10, 20, 30 spaces, 3 spaces around the world that are really trying to take what alternative means within their own context. I'm no one to come and say what alternative is here anymore, probably, or maybe I want to think that yes, but probably not. And the idea here is to really try to bring people who have the same desires into a network, into a space of convergence. And I think this is what we are not doing enough. So I hope you keep tuned to probably, hopefully, there will be a project in Barcelona, part of this worldwide storefront that we are going to open in the fall, and simultaneously try to produce projects and events that are going to activate our alternative ways of thinking. So, of course, this is the last project that I would have liked to explain, but then, that font is like falling apart. This is Office US. Office US is a project that was born out of the desire to bring the establishment and the self-proclaimed avant-garde and the corporate world together. There is a very strange tendency, mostly in the United States, of dividing what is corporate architecture versus what is critical architecture versus what is experimental architecture. And those divisions are self-imposed fictions, mostly to defend territories, not to actually think about how we contribute and think about the architecture that is actually happening out there. So we said, the US is very much of an example of an understanding of how we have practiced architecture around the globe. We are part of the generation that takes the globe as its site. The US has been the country that has built more than anyone and in most places than anyone, and through a very particular invention that is the invention of the corporate office. And so, of course, what I'm very interested is into bringing the spaces of disruption and creative action within that space of efficiency and delivery that the corporate world has been able to develop. And how do we do that? How do we make a project that is able to bring together those two people that don't necessarily know how to even sit in the same table? So we created this map that shows the projects made by US offices over the last 100 years around the world, and try to understand that over these 100 years, from 1914 to 2014, that is the framework that Rem Koolhaas, who is the curator for this upcoming Venice Biennale, gave every country, asking how did the project of modernity travel into every country and how it got disseminated. We are answering Rem's question as if we would be very good students. The problem is that we had the project before he even asked the question, what is kind of fascinating at the same time, but that has probably to do a lot with the zeitgeist. So within these 100 years, we identified 200 architecture offices, 90 of them are still practicing. And from these 200 offices, obviously, and these 1,001 buildings that we have selected out of more than 3,000 that we identified 25 issues. 25 office issues, office US issues that range from business model to questions of the comfort and how the idea of comfort has changed, to questions of labor, to questions of reprogramming, to questions of materials and smart materials. And of course, how do we talk about those 25 issues? When we talk about the smart materials, we don't talk about the latest technology. We go all the way back in 1946. This is the American ambassador in Moscow, and he's in an event, and like 3 kids go and give him a US seal in a wooden piece as a kind of a present, as a sculpture. And the ambassador takes it very nicely and he puts it in one of his meeting rooms because it was this very beautiful wooden solid material. After 6 years, through a routinary check, there was a microphone inside the eel inserted into the entire seal. Great. They take it down, the guy goes into the United Nations, presents the seal, this is how the Russians are dealing with cultural diplomacy, blah, blah. 4 years later, the Americans make another routinary inspection. They found 40 microphones inserted within the building, and they say, well, we need to build another building. I mean, this building is totally fucked up. We cannot survive it. And so they choose SOM to design their new embassy building. So through an entire management back and forth between Moscow and Washington, Washington gives the site for the Russians, Moscow gives the site for the Americans, and so they start to discuss what are the protocols of construction and management, and the Russians say, you know, we are going to make you like the entire building, we are going to make the concrete structure, and we are going to make just like the brick walls, and then you take care of the interior, and you will have supervisors on site, but this is how we do with all the other embassies, and that's how it should keep on going. And they were like, okay, fine. So they made the concrete structure supervised by SOM, and everything working and so on, and everything was normal, no microphones, no technology. 4 years later, with a routinary inspection, they realized that there were some strange materials. So they cut a concrete column, and they found that there was one of the rebars was a very strange rebar. So what they had done is not that they had inserted any microchips or anything, they just had inserted rebars to the entire building that perceived by a particular frequency, the entire building was spying everything that was happening inside. So the entire building was a spying machine. So the evolution was from the object to the insertion of the surface to the entire building becoming speaker machine. So how do you make your building a spy today when we are looking into nanotechnology and the insertion of elements within the concrete and so on? So we are trying to talk about issues that are contemporary through stories that tell us a lot about how architecture has participated in the politics and technologies of production. And of course, for that, we are going to bring over the 6 months of the Biennale these 125 experts and when we call experts, we call engineers and philosophers and experts on ignorance. I think they're extremely important. And we are going to have 90 worldwide Office US outposts. And these outposts, and I don't know if you have received the call for it, and if not, you should subscribe and then you should look at it. What we are interested is in creating a global office. And a global office is not that we have people working for us anywhere, is that there are things that we all share, that we all are interested, that we all would like to do, but we don't have the structures to produce them. We I'm inside a cultural institution. Someone is within the US government. Someone is within a university. Someone is within a corporate office because they have to pay their loans back. Someone is working in their own studio that is about interior design, but they have really high knowledge and diplomacy, and they want to contribute and they want to be part of something larger than their own space. So Office US ultimately is that. What we have is 6 people working in the pavilion who are going to be there over the 6 months, working with this archive of 1,000 projects that we have compiled. There have been, for almost 6 months, an entire team at MIT and at Ohio State University working relentlessly, producing a history of this past, a political history, an economic history, a material history, and we're going to give this content into the space of the pavilion to really try to articulate where we should go. Over these 6 months, over these 25 weeks, over these 25 issues, we are going to address from questions of material nature to territorial and global scale. So this project that at the end tries to bring people from all these different spaces of inquiry, of practice, wants to be able to bring people from all over the world and understand what is the local value, what is important to understand in Barcelona differently than in New York when we talk about public housing. So if we spend one entire week where we are going to have an entire 2-day intense session discussing housing, we want to end up after a week with a set of, if you want, resolutions or recommendations, or perhaps proposals of 10 different housing plan attacks for public space and public understanding around the world. So it's going to be intense. Yes, but we don't expect less than us. This is the ugly building that we inherited. Again, of course, a US building made by US architects in Italy in the 1930s with neo-Palladian style. We have a lot of this, of export and import. A lot of Americans have been exporting styles into places that they were the ones who exported that thing before. So we are very interested in 2 things. One is the architecture as a discipline, as a circulation of ideas in terms of its physicality, materiality, political and economical and social. But we are also interested in the protocols of the office. So that you have an overview of the team, and here this is just like a very small fraction. There are more than 300 people involved working literally in this project. And of course, 200 firms involved directly. And so what was fascinating about this project is having to sometimes go into the SOM headquarters and to meet with all the partners and to convince them that this is a project that they are part of. That even if I'm the director of Storefront for Art and Architecture, that crazy small little place that tries to agitate culture, I'm extremely serious about the fact that I want to take them seriously, and at the same time you want to take the ones who just have one project that are starting their firm seriously equally. So this list is a transversal section about anyone who has been building outside of their own immediate context. And this is how, in a certain way, Office US looks. Is everyone of the ones that we love, we like, we hate, we don't know, we respect, or we maybe don't. But the principle in here is that every one of those has a space of expertise to contribute. We are looking into contracts. We are looking into billing. How do you actually bill your clients? How do you talk to politicians? How do you organize your office? So of course this is the call for outpost, and I hope that you go online and you look at it and you submit. But part of the research that we have been doing really brings us a lot of the evidences of how we have changed as a profession. These are images from Ezra Stoller, who has donated incredible amount of work to illustrate this project. We have looked into Albert Kahn, a guy who developed his expertise in the factories in Detroit, and he was hired by Lenin. And he really exported the entire Ford factory understanding into also not only Russia, but his workplace. Taylorism as a space of production and efficiency became the model for the organization of his office. And the idea that there is a head and that there is a distribution of labor and that there is space for the production of architecture that is also a machinery is what constitutes the space of corporate architecture. How can we transform that with the spaces of disruption? We are looking in embassies and the space of representation and national imagery. We are looking into the different protocols that have changed after the bombings. And so the topic that we are addressing here is called love and anger management. Of course, people queue to enter into the US embassies trying to get visas, and people bomb US embassies. And of course that has to do a lot with the architecture, the fences, and the spaces of engagement with that. We are also of course looking into the high-end resorts and into many of those things that ultimately are being compiled into this repository, into this library that when you will be able to go into the pavilion, you will be asked if you have an appointment. So I urge you to get an appointment with Office US if you want to visit the pavilion in Venice. You can apply for a volunteering position, or you can decide to just be a voyeur, and then we will give you probably some gloves so that you don't put our files too dirty. But the idea is that the office is going to be an office. People are going to be working there for 6 months with these visiting experts in connection with these 90 office outposts. And so this is where like some of this content is going to be displayed, and some of these ideas of issues that we want to address, from women to profit to the relationship of projects to the different exchange value of the currencies to a certain understanding of the dollar as a referential point, to try to see if there was any relationship between economic peak or not in relationship to export. That is not. But that's part of research. You do research in order to validate some of the points that you do. And how that is being designed is very simple. It's a table. What do we need to start working? A table to discuss. Yet this is also an exhibition. So this table has a thickness designed by Leong. This table where we are going to be working is also a space of display where we will find from office manuals to models to buildings to objects, these curatorial objects that try to ask questions. And the wall is going to be chronologically ordered from 1914 to 2014, almost as a kind of a library to be consulted and observed. As any good office, it should have a bed or a sofa, so of course we have one, and a kitchen. So I invite you to come and to look into some of these books, and we talked about books, and I want to show you just some of the material. This is a project where, in fact, the involvement of people is not just a sheer amount. There has been a huge amount of research really trying to talk about Nathalie de Blois. She was one of the head architects at SOM. No one really knows about her. She was the head architect behind the Hilton in Istanbul, many projects. We are looking again into some of the newer spaces of the workplace. How many of you work from bed? I do, a lot. And so the idea is like, what is the new landscape of the office? And it is a table, it is a bed, but we are looking from the Cold War to all kind of different aspects of what it means to look into the last 100 years of architectural production and reflect where we are going. So while these publications are going to come, and so of course this one is already going to be there, the second one is an atlas of texts and projects, the third one is an office manual where we have been compiling, and I don't know how many of you have been working in an office, but when you enter the first day they give you a manual and they say, hey, these are the protocols, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. By the way, this is confidential, right? And there are incredible things from how you name the layers of your drawings, to how you talk to your clients, to how you actually can address personal issues. In the US, all of this is regulated, right? How when even some of the offices, they regulate what do you do when you have problems with procrastination, or when you have a problem with drugs, and I mean, it's just fascinating about like sexual relationships within the offices are forbidden. I mean, it's like, and people work so much better when they are in love, right? So the whole question here is that, so we are writing a manual that is made out of quotes of all these last 100 years of protocols, and we have been asking a series of people, contemporary people, to produce contemporary quotes, and at the same time we are going to have the entry of how this Office US, we hope it works, where procrastination, that I don't know if you're familiar with the word, but I always say that procrastination in Catalan or in Spanish is called siesta. And that's a cultural difference that I think really explains a lot about the nature of architectural protocols of production. So it was funny, I was trying to take this to take notes, and I just realized that this is a letter, it's a draft, it's addressed to the president. The second line says the White House, and the address is 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Northwest, Washington DC 2500. It's a letter, I need to sign it because we want the president obviously to come to see Office US and to see how it transforms into Office Us. And this has to do with the fact that sometimes we like to talk about our work among ourselves, among architects, among people that are very knowledgeable of what we do and what is the intent and relevance of the beauty. But how do we go and talk to the people outside there? Sometimes it starts by writing a letter to the mayor or to the president or to someone else. And I think that's extremely important. Yet, of course, as you can all imagine, what was inside my book was nothing else than ham and fouet. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Eva. Silvia is asking me whether I knew that you had ham on, because I just imagined. No, thank you for your lecture. I am sure you're not angry, but I'm pretty sure that you are obsessed. And thank you for sharing your position coming out of this obsession. Is there any question for Eva?
Come on, I don't bite.
Okay.
I didn't quite understand how they actually transform a building into a spy machine. Can you please give us more information?
Working on smart materials, that's why he's interested.
Yes. This is not my computer, like my computer. I can, if you want, I can pass you the entire folder of information that we have, but I invite you to come and to look into our pavilion. So the way in which they did, they inserted metal rods that were able, I mean, the information of the entire detail, I don't have the technical knowledge, but there are two informes from the White House, one obviously, and the other one is from the CIA, that they used only from a particular receiver with a particular frequency. It was the way in which they were able to capture the space, the conversations that were happening. So the entire embassy design is based in the fact that the interior rooms, they need to be isolated. So it didn't really matter if the building was capturing, if they would have inserted microphones inside the concrete structure, they would have not been able to spy, because the microphones, they work through air. So the idea is that they knew they were going to produce something that even with these isolated floating inner chambers still was going to be able to register the waves of the waves of the voice that was actually transmitting through the air. So and so of course SOM, that was the architect in charge, and they had been supervising, and they had really high security measures. I mean, that was a really like big problem, because then of course they were also shortlisted to design the embassy in Beijing. And so then there are a lot of other security measures. So you have to imagine that for the ones that spying situation was discovered, they decided to tear down the 3 top floors of the embassy to produce an entire new system of suspension joints for the BT. They knew that they had a building that was broadcasting everything below, so they decided to build 3 new floors on the top. And so for that they decided to bring, and they shipped with containers with diplomatic clearance all the materials, the concrete, everything, like the sand. And so the whole process of understanding the protocols of, and so I'm sure that you're interested more in the technology side, right? Not in the protocols, but we are very interested in the protocols of engagement on that. So I don't know about the technology side, but I can send you all those elements, because they are there and they are going to be there to be looked and observed. But there are some people who are really working into those elements right now at MIT that are the ones who we're going to try to bring as experts to discuss about what do we do now with materials that are able not only to perceive and absorb data, and not only to speak, but also to sense in some ways, right? So we are very interested in understanding the sensorial and alive aspects of materiality. But I don't have that much information. Someone said, are there, and I have a note somewhere, were these materials this? And I said, I don't know. So there are things that I don't know.
Okay, if there is no other question, then I would like to invite you all, because...
My question is about your projects which are intended to evoke behavior or to examine behavior. And I'm wondering if how often you intend to, or you expect certain results based on what you're proposing, or you expect to be surprised, or you want to be surprised, and what the balance is between those two expectations, and then also how you register the degree by which you are surprised by behavior when you are surprised.
I mean, this is a really good question. I mean, the entire act of us differently, right? Institutions, when we ask for grants, they say, what is your measure of success? Right? Because they want to know, if they give you X dollars, how do you say that you managed to do that what you wanted to do? And then you say, how soon do you want this success to be perceived? Right? And so there is this guy who's called Sinan Najafi, who is one of the founders of Cabinet magazine, he applied for a grant, a very big grant, and they said, well, what is your strategy of growth? I'm going to answer your question, but first let me make a little detour. And they said, I said, what is your strategy of growth? And he said, I am not planning to grow. We publish these issues, we publish this number of issues, and this is what we want to do. I said, but no, I mean, but what is your real plan of growth? He said, no, there is no plan of growth. You don't go to an ant and say, when are you going to be an elephant, right? An ant is an ant, has a function within society. Therefore, I mean, it's absurd that you're asking me, either you support my mission and you give me the money for what I do, or you don't. And so, and with this same answer, part of the function of a storefront is to produce experiments that not necessarily are measurable and quantifiable, right? When behaviorism entered the space of architectural discourse and inquiry, it entered with a really bad fit, right? In the 70s and 80s, everyone was extremely scared, mostly probably coming from very particular scared minds, I would say. But the idea is, how do we understand how we feel and how we react? Is not a problem, is extremely necessary to be attentive and to understand that the subject is part of the projects that we do. To transform that reading into a fact or into a form or into a space, then it's problematic. So I do that constantly. I try to provoke, as when we know that if we go in lingerie in the street, we are going to provoke certain things. There are codes and legibilities, yet what we try to produce are disruptions. So sometimes the fact that we, within a setting of a formal event, we produce a productive disagreement, that's already a disruption of the event in and of itself first. And then I sense if I see it's productive or not. The fact that they didn't disagree, it was extremely productive, because it makes it even more evident that actually we are very far away from being close to any resolution. So sometimes the failure of not actually getting that what I wanted in the beginning is just a representation of the condition in which we are in that is more powerful than anything else that could have happened. And there are a lot of things that I don't measure in a time span that is quantifiable or transformable in my own understanding. But it has to do a lot with being very close and listening a lot, but ignoring everyone. Mostly because if you really listen, people will never really understand what is that you are really trying to do, because as I was saying before in your class, it's extremely hard when you are up to something to explain that what you're up to, right? Unless you already have been there and you already know where you are. And so that doesn't mean that you need to uncover yourself within that obfuscation, but there is don't go into a writer and say, can you tell me what you are writing about? He would say, no, I'm writing it, right? So a lot of the processes in which architecture tries to engage itself with behaviorism, if we want to use that word, or with reading the subject, sometimes falls too much into the abuse of causality. If you do this, this is what will happen. If you do this, this is what we will do. This is... And I think that's the problem. When there is a closure of there needs to be a closure of the situation, right, in which you know exactly what is that you are producing, what are the terms, what are the conditions that you are bringing into a table, but it needs to be an openness of the possibilities, and if that is not specified within the spaces of argumentation, then it's going to fail. So a lot of people, when they come to me and they say, Eva, we don't understand what is happening at the storefront. We really don't. Like, there are so many things happening. And I'm like, do I really need to explain it? Right? Do I really have to give you a map of everything? Like, this is what it's trying to do into the meta level. This is what it's doing into the social level. And I do have those plans and structures, but sometimes you need to produce some work in order to get somewhere, and then you have to produce some things that, yes, give results. So at the end, I didn't answer your question. I answered many questions that I have in myself, but the question here is that again, I think you really need to listen a lot to what people say, and to look a lot to what people have done before. I think what is happening tremendously is that there is a huge space of oblivion. I mean, I was just looking, Buckminster Fuller, he wrote a text in 1939, 38, 39, that was never published, and it was just like excavated the other day, that is called The Ballistics of Civilization, right? And it's like the ballistics of civilization, telling you society, civilization has a kind of trajectory that we can inflect by actually disturbing it in some way, and of course that influenced in a certain how cybernetics afterwards started thinking about the way in which we affect trajectories and missiles and so on. But he was very much interested in trying to understand how we behave, how we are within a space, how do we react to certain aspects, but the problem we have is that when what was I looking today that really fascinated me? There was an article that was looking into how many hours and what hours do geniuses sleep, right? As if that would be an index of any genius. And it's like you would say, what is the color of the nails that the geniuses would paint their nails on a Tuesday night, right? If they would happen to paint their nails on a Tuesday night. And so this is the problem that we have when we get too close into understandings of correlationships, of causality. What you are measuring and what you think that actually means, so problematic sometimes. So this is where it is not about correlations, it is about methodologies and building up on things that we already do. That's why rituals are so important. I'm not here because I came here to give a lecture. I'm here because my nephew is getting his communion on Sunday. Something that I don't even know how to even accept it, but you do it. You want to be there because he's going to go through that, and you want to see how he goes through that and how he overcomes it, and so on, right? So there is something extremely important of understanding, of listening, of being part of the society and cultures that we belong, to really be able to act on it. Because if we don't engage in that, then we will just be our monks in our paradise, and I like that too, but now I happen to be a monk in New York. So I think I answered that.
Thank you.